Hello, and welcome to the Fallen Tree. I know a lot of you have been here before. If you're new, thanks for joining the journey. Today, we're going to get started on making some hardwood tongue groove flooring. And it all started with this red oak that I cut down on my property. Just like everything else in the cabin, from tree to cabin. So, I started this last spring when I originally started cutting it down. I quickly got it on the sawmill and started milling. I knew this was going to be a long process, and we needed to let it sit and get down under 10% for the flooring so we didn't get too much shrinkage. I believe when I first tested it with my moisture meter, I was over 18% on this log. And the base of this log was almost more than my Woodland Mills 126 could handle. It got a little bit wide when I went to take the second cut. So I had to get out a chainsaw and just cut off a little piece so it could get by. So I continued cutting all the logs down to approximately 1 inch. It took a while, but I'm sure that the results are going to be spectacular. Eventually, I ended up with a couple piles of boards that I stickered in between, covered with some metal roofing, and let them sit after I strapped them down. I ended up with a few different piles. There's still a couple out in the woods. Here's a couple of them. So we're going to get started by checking the moisture in these and making sure they're ready. We're down at about 9.5%. So I'm going to start cutting off one edge on the straight pieces with my table saw. And I'm not cutting them down to the size that I want, but I'm just taking a little bit off because I'm trying to get a straight edge after having a rough cut from the sawmill. I'm going to flip these back and forth several times to get them down to the size that I want, which is going to eventually straighten them little by little and taking out the imperfections. Okay, so this is my setup to get started. I've got some place to put the wood that I cut. Got a table saw with a table to slide it out onto so I can do it by myself. See, not a fancy, expensive table saw. I've had this one, I bet you over 20 years now. And it's pretty much done the job that I've needed it to do throughout those 20 years. I did clamp on a feather board to it. That keeps everything tight to the fence to keep a nice, consistent cut along the edge of the board. As I push it out, I got this push stick so my fingers aren't getting close to the blade. And I've got a small joiner here to kind of smooth it out a little bit and take out some of the rough spots in the board. I can see a few of these have quite a bit of a crown in them. We might have to cut a few of these boards over here. Some of them got a little crown in them, so might have to cut a few of them with a circular saw and a chalk line just to get them started out. So ripping the edges of these boards on the table saw, I'm going to go through this pile about 6 times before I get it down to the width that I'm looking for, which is about 5 1/4 inches, which once I route the tongue into them will give me a 5-inch board. If you're looking at these as they're coming through the table saw, you'll see they're a little rigid. And as I said before, every time I flip it in between cuts, it's going to take a little bit of that out and straighten up the board, going back and forth. Some of them, like this one, pretty much resemble a banana. So I'm going to take a chalk line and create a straight line that I can follow with my circular saw. This is going to give me a fairly straight board that I can put up against the fence of the table saw and cut off the other side. By doing this, the pieces that I cut for the tongue and groove later, I can use longer pieces that will mate together nicely. Okay, I've got the first cut on this entire stack here of boards. I faced all the cut edges this way. These are going to go on the fence for this next cut. We're going to take another 1/8 of an inch off. I adjusted my feather board so it'll hold it up against the fence. And we're going to go through and take an 1/8 off of every one of those pieces. Then we're probably going to flip it, move it in an 1/8 again, and do that a couple more times, and that's going to help straighten everything out. By going back and forth, just taking off a little bit at a time, it's going to take out the imperfections on each side and make some straighter boards and make it easier for us to work with after we put the tongue and groove on and start putting it together as flooring. So let's get started. It's going to be a long and grueling process, but I'm sure it'll be worth it in the end. I got 10, 12 hours into it at this point. Out here by myself, ripping and flipping. Bunch of sawdust to show for it. Got it all strapped up. And the next weekend, I started getting going on the planing. This will be another process where I just take a little bit at a time and get it down to the desired thickness of just under 3/4 of an inch is what I'm aiming for. Now as I'm doing this, I'm going to be flipping it and making sure that my top's fairly flat. But the bottom, I kind of want to leave it a little bit rough. I want to give it a little accent as you look up from underneath to make it look more rough sawn. So it might have some flat spots, but then you might see some roughness too. I think this will give it a nice look. Now, as you can see, this is the first pass here, and it's real patchy. But we're starting to get it all to a uniform thickness, so we can just keep coming down. And some got a little bit more than others. But it's going to look beautiful when it's done. As I'm watching this go through the planer, I just love to look at the wood grain and seeing how beautiful this tree's growing through the years. The grain just pops in this red oak. I think I picked a really nice tree for this flooring. So as I continue taking off a 1/16 each time I go through this, flipping it when I feel the need, and making sure that the top is absolutely flat, we head on to the next step, which will be the final planing and cutting it down to length. As I take each final pass with the boards, I look at each one of them, see how straight it is, see how many knots it has in it, and determine a length for each board. I'm using 1 foot intervals because that's what I've got my 4x4s in the cabin spaced out. I did have a couple oddball measurements that I also made a few, such as an 8-inch, a 37-inch, and I think an 18-inch. I made 3 of each one of those for some uneven space joists. But knowing that there's not going to be a subfloor, I cut the rest at 1 foot intervals, plus a 1/4 inch for the tongue that's going to be there. And then they'll break evenly on the joists below. Pieces like this one that still had a nice crown in it, I'm going to cut to a shorter length, and the straighter ones, I'm going to make longer lengths. So I've got anywhere between 1 foot and 9 foot on these joists. I'm also taking the time to cut out all the larger knots in the boards. And as you can see here, this one had a really nice rough texture to the bottom of it that I left. I had a tooth that wasn't quite set right when I cut this board, which left all that grooving in it. And then every once in a while, once I get done with my final planing, I'll notice a spot that on the table saw didn't quite straighten out just right, and you could see a little jag in it. So I would take that quickly through the planer and get rid of the unevenness. This process of planing down the material left a ton of shavings. As a matter of fact, it filled up this 26-gallon trash container 12 times for a total of 312 gallons of shavings that I've used for mulch around the yard. So here's the final flooring, and next time we'll get going on the tongue groove process. But I think it's going to look spectacular. If you enjoyed this part of the journey, click subscribe if you haven't, share with your friends, comment, let me know what you think. Until next time, my friends.